Welcome back, Terms of Service listeners. I'm Claire Duffy. When you're texting someone, it can feel like it's just you, your screen, and the person on the other end. But it's not always as simple as that. There are scenarios where third parties might be able to access your messaging data, whether it's your employer or law enforcement. So in this hyper-connected world, how can you make sure your private conversations are actually private? To answer this question, I have Rihanna Pfefferkorn here with me. Rihanna is a policy fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. She's a lawyer by training, and these days, her research covers encryption policy, digital surveillance, cybersecurity, and online trust and safety. Hi, Rihanna. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So if you don't mind sharing, where do most of your text-based conversations happen?
I would say probably mostly either on Signal or on iMessage, especially with my family members, because we all have iPhones, and on the computer, probably on Slack with my coworkers.
Got it. So obviously, this probably varies a bit depending on what messaging service you're using. But just to sort of lay the foundation here, when someone sends a basic text message or email to another person, what happens? Where does it go as it's being sort of transmitted to the recipient?
Well, there's going to be potentially cell service towers and satellites and, ground-based wiring like in between, but ultimately it's going from your device, like your phone or your computer, through the server of whatever service is delivering your messages, and then like ultimately out to the other person's device.
And many messaging services these days use some form of encryption to make sure the message content is protected. In the most layman's terms possible, can you just describe what encryption is?
Encryption is a means of scrambling your message, whether that's a text or the audio for a phone call, in such a way that it is basically gobbledygook to anybody observing it from the outside using mathematical algorithms.
And what about end-to-end encryption? What does that mean? How is that different from maybe basic encryption?
Sure. So remember that I said that you have your device and your message or your call will be routed through a server and then off to the endpoint device of the other person. So your device and the other person's device, those are the ends, right? And with end-to-end encryption, the difference is that whoever that intermediary is that is transmitting your call or your messages from one point to the other point, they can't decode that message either. They don't have the key. They may be providing the encryption, but they don't necessarily have the means to decrypt it. So when it's passing through that server, even whoever's managing that server, maybe it's Apple or maybe it's Signal or whoever, they cannot decrypt and see the actual content of your communications. They would still only see the gobbledygook.
So on that note, if a message isn't end-to-end encrypted, who could potentially have access to the content of that message?
Well, for one thing, whoever is providing that service may be able to decrypt the message if they've got the key to decrypt it, and then they could see those contents. They may be able to provide them to somebody else. Somebody else might also be able to intervene and potentially find a way to descramble the contents of that communication, and then potentially change what it says and send it onward. So something that says, please show up this afternoon as scheduled, some intermediary could, we would call this a man-in-the-middle attack, change that message to say, please don't show up this afternoon as scheduled.
And when you're talking about that kind of intermediary, you're talking about like a hacker or a bad actor in most cases, right?
That's right.
And when you talk about the company or whoever's operating that server potentially being able to hand off that information to someone else, who are you talking about there? Is that law enforcement?
It would mostly be law enforcement who would have to come with a warrant to get the contents of your communications. Internally, there may be situations where the company that's providing a service may want to look at the contents of communications for trust and safety reasons or for protecting its own interests. And so that's the difference between encrypting messages end-to-end and having something that's encrypted in a way that is hopefully proof against outside attackers, but which the company itself would be able to decrypt and read.
What are some scenarios where people should be paying extra attention to the security of their messages and might be wanting that end-to-end encryption?
I mean, there's a wide variety of them. Maybe if you're talking to your doctor, now that especially telehealth and other online intermediated services rather than face-to-face appointments have become more common. I'm an attorney by training, as you mentioned, and as lawyers, we have ethical rules to protect the confidentiality of client communications. And so lawyers need to be very careful about the cybersecurity and data privacy of how they converse with their clients, as well as how they protect their own internal work product, and really any conversation you're having that is sensitive with somebody else. I also think that there is a lot of value in having end-to-end encryption, even for the most boring and innocuous conversations that you've got, because we know that there are regions in the world where switching from using a non-end-to-end encrypted service to an encrypted service may itself look like a red flag. If a government is monitoring communications networks and sees somebody switch, that might be a note to say, well, maybe we should take a more intensive look at this person. Whereas if everybody's using end-to-end encryption for everything, even if I'm just messaging my husband, hey, do I need to pick up anything at the grocery store on the way home? That I think ends up helping everybody by further normalizing and making it less conspicuous to be using end-to-end encrypted messaging.
Yeah, I will say often as journalists, we communicate with sources on Signal via end-to-end encryption to make sure that those conversations are protected. And there have been cases, right, where law enforcement has requested data from messaging services and other online platforms. Sometimes those companies try to push back on those requests. Sometimes they're legally required to hand over that information. Have we seen the relationship between messaging services and law enforcement sort of change or evolve over the last decade or so?
I would say that when I first came to Stanford a decade ago, specifically to study encryption policy, we are at a much more fraught moment between law enforcement and the providers of both encrypted messaging as well as encryption for your devices at rest. Back then, I started working at Stanford right before the San Bernardino shooting, which led to the so-called Apple v. FBI showdown over attempts to unlock the shooter's iPhone. And so at that point in time, the focus was really on device encryption. And then a few years later, it shifted to focusing more on messaging encryption, with rationales around terrorism and around child safety being used as a argument for why end-to-end encryption shouldn't be as broadly on offer as it has been. But I think we've seen, as we've connected everything to the internet and have become a fully information society, that good standards of privacy and cybersecurity have become all the more indispensable to protect all of our communications.
Yeah. And part of what you're talking about there, right, is we've seen this sort of more recent movement from certain governments around the world pushing for less access to end-to-end encryption because they say they want to be able to investigate crimes, right? But then the companies say we've made these privacy promises to our users and people should be able to have private conversations. That's kind of the tension that you're touching on there, right?
Yeah, we've seen that tension repeatedly. I think we are at an interesting moment, even just within the last year or so, because you may recall it wasn't that long ago that large-scale Chinese hacking of telecommunication systems came to light. And, in part is due to the ability of law enforcement to wiretap regular phone calls, just over the wire phone calls, in ways that in general, we don't see regular phone service providers providing encryption for calls, even as things like WhatsApp that offers end-to-end encrypted calling have become more popular. And so I think that was, a bit of egg on the face probably of this anti-encryption approach, because now we see, oh my gosh, this was a massive, really humiliating, frankly, hack to have happen to our telecommunication services. It demonstrates that for journalists and lawyers and doctor-patient relations, all of those things we were just talking about, that there is a real risk of outside eavesdroppers listening in. And so the narrative of lawful access to communications for the good guys nevertheless provides a vulnerability that can be leveraged by either national level adversaries or organized crime or whoever has those capabilities.
It feels like this conversation has become especially relevant as we've seen governments try to draw on data from tech companies, for example, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, or more recently amid the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. Do people need to be thinking more carefully right now about what they think are private communications?
Absolutely. I mean, the best time to start using end-to-end encryption for your calls or for your messages was yesterday, and the second best time is today. And so, if you're not already using something like Signal, that would be very wise to switch to. If you are at all worried that you might become a target of this administration, which, as we've seen for everybody from, trans kids to trans adults to immigrants, whether they're documented or have lawful status in this country, to protesters, a lot of people have reasons to want to increase their privacy posture.
How do you recommend that people keep their private messages private? Can you give us sort of some practical tips here?
There are a variety of different services out there, which I think is great. If you compare messaging apps to browsers or to mobile operating systems, there's actually a lot of different messaging apps out there. I think I have like 5 on my phone, and that's probably maybe not necessarily the case for a lot of other parts of our online lives where maybe there's only 1 of 2 options and we've gone with one or the other. iMessage, if you're only talking to other iPhone users, Android messages are encrypted if you're talking to other Android users. Signal works across mobile operating systems, and you can run it on desktop. WhatsApp also is end-to-end encrypted by default. So is Messenger now, another offering from Meta. Those services all differ in how much metadata, meaning non-message contents, information about a message, they gather and keep, and for how long, and what level of security do they apply to that? But nevertheless, at least having something that is end-to-end encrypted by default for your conversations, like I said, even for the less sensitive ones, just to normalize the usage of it. There's also options in many of these apps for making your messages disappear after a certain amount of time. You may be able to set your messages to disappear after a day or a week or 4 weeks, something like that, so that even if somebody does get access to your phone, those messages would no longer be sitting there on it. I think people also need to think about where their messages are backing up to, depending on how you have your settings in the particular messaging apps that you may be using. Those may be uploaded and backed up to your cloud storage, whether you're using Google Cloud as an Android user, whether you have iCloud. And those can be, I think, a gap in where people are thinking about. They may have a false sense of security of, my messages are end-to-end encrypted. Well, that's true as they're going over the wire. But if your backup is not also end-to-end encrypted, then that may potentially be accessible. So people need to weigh, based on their own personal position and what threats or worries they have, whether it would be a good idea for them personally to turn on end-to-end encryption for their backups as well in order to protect their messages.
Yeah, it's interesting. WhatsApp, I constantly get that pop-up that's like, do you want to back up your conversations? And my feeling is always like, I'm just not going to do that. There's nothing that's important enough to me to have to worry about then protecting that backup. But I think a really important reminder to people to check up on their settings for these various messaging apps. You mentioned Slack in the workplace. How should people be thinking about the sort of security and the privacy of the conversations that happen there?
The thing about Slack is that it was not built to be a personal, private conversation mechanism. It was built as workplace software. And so the expectation is that the administrator of a workplace is going to have the ability to read your direct messages with other users or to see in the channels that you are a part of. And so if the administrator of a Slack workspace is itself somebody that you don't necessarily want to see your messages, for example, if you're doing organizing in your workplace, and your workplace is the one offering the Slack, maybe that's not the best venue for your organizing messaging.
Yeah, such an important point that I think it can start to feel like you can have private DMs with coworkers, but those conversations are not always private. A lot of people consider Signal to be the gold standard for private messaging. And you mentioned earlier this piece about the amount of metadata that these companies retain, even if they're not able to see the actual content of our messages. Will you talk about the benefits of using Signal in particular?
Yeah, I mean, Signal is well known for being end-to-end encrypted by default and always has been. But it's also, I think, considered the gold standard in part because they keep so little data about their users, which impacts the amount of information that they are able to disclose, even if they do, as they very occasionally do, get warrants or other orders to try and require the disclosure of information. And when that happens, basically all they can say is like, look, here's the last login time that we have for when somebody first signed up for Signal and for the last login time when they actually logged in and used Signal. So that's a very small amount of information. And that is by contrast to a company like Meta, which owns WhatsApp, which keeps a lot more metadata about people and therefore has a lot more information that they are able to disclose to law enforcement on demand. Again, even if they don't have access to message contents, they have a lot more information about IP addresses and what accounts are associated with that. With Signal, they know very little. And so what you don't collect, what you don't keep, you can't be compelled to turn over.
Yeah. You brought up Signalgate, which many people probably have heard of. Earlier this year, U.S. officials accidentally added a journalist to a Signal chat where they were discussing military plans. Beyond picking a secure platform, which is obviously really important when we're talking about the privacy of our messages, what do people need to know about how to safely engage on these platforms in order to avoid those kinds of user errors?
Yeah, one thing that I have seen happening this year in response to the new administration is a lot more people no longer using their regular wallet names as their display names in Signal and moving to just using their initials, for example. Signal now also offers the ability to add somebody to your Signal contacts through a username rather than knowing their phone number. So if I don't want to share my phone number, I can share my Signal username, and then that's what shows up for them. But if all you have listed in your contacts is RP, you don't necessarily know that that's me. And so now what is, I think, useful is the ability to add a little note to yourself, like a little nickname, so that you know who this person is. And you can differentiate that this is the correct person that I am trying to add, instead of unwittingly sweeping in somebody whose presence in that group conversation might compromise everybody's safety, privacy, or security.
And you touched on this as well, but I think it's just really important to sort of underscore this for folks. Let's say I am just sending memes to my friends. We're not having any kind of important conversation. Should I still care about the privacy of those communications?
I think we should all care about the privacy of our communications basically as a default. You know, it used to be, prior to the advent of digital communications, that our conversations were all private and all ephemeral. If you talk to somebody face to face, those weren't being recorded and stored indefinitely for somebody in the future to trawl through looking for something to use against you. The expectation was that it was sort of one and done. And then we saw this sort of inversion through the ability, as data storage got cheaper and as digitally mediated communication got more prevalent, that now it was possible to log everything that we said and keep it around forever. And so what I've seen, going back to our discussion about arguments against making encryption available to people, was almost this expectation of entitlement among law enforcement, that now that a lot of things were being recorded and stored forever, that they should now have the expectation that they are entitled to access everything about our communications. And I think going back to using the ability of end-to-end encryption to reclaim that previous baseline expectation of privacy and ephemerality that we used to have in our communications, no matter how inconsequential and innocuous they are, is something that would benefit us all as a society.
Yeah. Is there anything I didn't ask you about this that you think is important to mention here?
I think basically just to keep pushing back on the narrative that if you've got nothing to hide, then you don't need privacy. Everybody has something to hide. I think the attacks on so many vulnerable populations in this administration have really shown that. But it's always been the case. Like I said, privacy has long been much more of a default expectation that now gets, I think, eroded bit by bit. And my hope is that as the use of end-to-end encryption has become more and more normalized, whether people realize that that's what they're using in their messaging app of choice or not, that we all understand better that privacy is a fundamental human right and not something that is only deployed by people who have something malicious that they're trying to hide.
Yeah. Well, Rihanna, thank you so much for doing this. This was really helpful.
Thank you again for having me on.